I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of TGU, the weekly panel discussion on anything that's fit to talk about from around the world of local government. Brought to you by the VLGA and of course sponsored by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Coming up today, we will get to that big story that's being covered around the country and internationally, I notice, the monumental nomination stuff up in New South Wales ahead of their council elections, which are due next month. But there's a lot happening closer to home as well. We've had a councillor resign just before an arbiter's report was to be tabled. We've had some interesting notices of motion passed by councils as the clock ticks on this council term. A monitor has been installed at Horsham. That's by my count, I think number 7 in terms of current monitor appointments, and much more to talk about. And to help us dissect all of that, Tony Rownick is with us from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Hello, Tony.
Hey, Chris. Gosh, as you say, what a big week it was in local government this week, and
still
so
is.
much to talk about.
Some of it's still bubbling away as we talk. Julie Reid's here as well. Hi, Julie.
Hi. Yeah, it's the gift that keeps giving this week for news in local government, isn't it? But there's there's been some great stuff that local government have done this week as well. So no doubt we'll talk about that as we go today.
Yes, there certainly is. We're going to talk about high fives as well in just a little while. But I want to start with a story I haven't even mentioned yet, and that is a surprise move by the City of Melbourne this week to cancel their contracts with Lime and Neuron for e-scooter hire in the CBD. This has created an interesting situation where you can hire an e-scooter, or will be able to, in Yarra and Port Phillip, but not in the Melbourne CBD because the council's withdrawing its contracts. There's been some criticism of that. And Julie, I think a lot of people caught by surprise by this last-minute move.
Yeah, I think they were actually, Chris. And it's interesting because the council are saying that so many people are causing disruption. They're disobeying the law on e-scooters. They're not following the rules. They're riding around without helmets. They're double dinking. There's people on groups riding on the footpath. They're creating havoc in the city, and pedestrians are obviously feeling the effects of this. And, they say that even just stepping out of, the town hall, it's just chaos. So they've had enough. They've had enough of this this impact. Now, it's not going to mean that people can't use their own personal scooters. So this is only the hire scooters that are found everywhere in the city, but people will still be able to use their own private scooters. They're just banning the ones that are provided by those organisations. They're not giving the organisations very long. They're saying we're going to give you 5 days notice and 30 days to remove the e-scooters from the city. So we're going to see them gone pretty quickly. And look, that's the council's decision. It'd be interesting to see whether other places are going to follow. They're saying they're following the Paris model. They're saying that Paris banned the e-scooters, and that's what they're talking about, which is very topical, I suppose, at this point in time, Chris.
Well, yes, Julie. And of course, it comes at a time when the state government has just announced that the trials are ending and the e-scooters are here to stay. The Premier, Jacinda Allen, called the decision of Melbourne City Council interesting. She said she hoped they would reconsider it. And Tony, there was, I think, a flurry of late legal letters. This broke in the media before the meeting happened earlier this week. But I assume that they've had advice to say that they could do this with their contracts. There's probably something in the terms and conditions.
Yeah, I'm sure they've analysed the contracts and looked at the termination clause. But yeah, the language used by the Premier Jacinda Allen, describing it as an interesting decision, I think is important here. And one might surmise that there might be action by the state government probably post the council election cycles here. I think that there's probably some politics here. I think one of the lead candidates for Lord Mayor, Aaron Wood, had a policy about banning e-scooters, and we've seen one of the other candidates, existing Mayor Nick Rhys has seemed to have got on board with that. That could be some of the reasoning here, but
A bit of
might think,
one-upmanship, you think, going on there?
yeah, look, possibly, but
Maybe.
certainly we've got this unique situation, as you've pointed out, and then pointed out in the media, where you hire your e-scooter in Port Melbourne, and you want to drive it to, in the city of Port Phillip, you want to ride it to Richmond in the city of Yarra. Well, you can't go through, you might necessarily be able to do that because you have to ride through the CBD to get there. So one would think that, this is a vehicle, we're talking about vehicle management, cars, etc., governed by state government law. We might see the state government step in potentially
maybe.
and regulate this across the CBD.
Okay, let's wait and see. The Lord Mayor Nick Rhys is in the news again this morning as we record this. The Herald Sun's reported on a plan to introduce a renewable energy scheme along the lines of one that operates in Sydney, which purportedly would save residents and businesses a lot on their power bills. But I think it's also predicated on some of those neighbouring councils joining in as well to deliver the sorts of savings the Herald Sun's talking about today. But that wasn't actually on my list. There's so much other stuff. Let's move on to Marybeck, where Councillor James Conlon is no longer a councillor. He resigned this week with immediate effect, just before an arbiter's decision was to be tabled. This was about an application for a finding of misconduct because of, Tony, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, because of the use of the word shamefully in a social media post about some of his colleagues.
Yeah, that's correct. And not only was there an allegation of misconduct, but yes, as you say, there was a finding by a very experienced arbiter, Joanne Mazzio, that Councillor Conlon's Facebook post in March, where he referred to his and 5 other Marybeck councillors voting for a motion for council to stop doing business with companies profiting from war and weapon production, to continue flying the Palestinian flag, and to create a $10,000 support fund for Palestinian asylum seekers and their families. So his Facebook post, in mentioning that he and those 5 other councillors supported that motion, he used language saying, shamefully, numerous councillors left the meeting during the Palestine item to avoid voting. And then he went on to name 3 councillors. The arbiter said that, as you say, the use of shamefully was disrespectful towards those named councillors. And her reasons were, look, there's nothing in the legislation or the governance framework that prohibits councillors from leaving a meeting partway through. She also said Councillor Conlon wasn't in a position to conclude what the rationale was for those councillors leaving the meeting. And then she then went on and said, and I think this is really interesting, she went on and said, in the event that the councillors did excuse themselves from the meeting to avoid voting on the item, there's no prohibition on that, and there should be no negative connotations. So, my thoughts are here that we're going down a new path here where potentially, provided what a councillor does is legal, strictly legal, then another councillor may not be able to be critical or use pejorative words about that behaviour on social media or in other ways. And I know this is a pretty emotive resolution. We know that the Gaza conflict is, there are very strong views on either sides, and one might understand why some councillors would be, nervous about taking a personal stand here. But imagine the councillor, councillors deliberately left the room so they didn't have to vote on the budget, or something other of other great significance. One might think that the electors expect councillors to take a stand on things that are before the council, and one might also think that it's reasonable for a councillor to be critical of another councillor's unwillingness to participate in a resolution before council. interesting to see where this goes, but I think you've got a lot of potential to be used as a precedent in other contexts.
So,
Yeah, and
Tony, just to be clear, sorry, Julie, 1 second. You think this is just taking it a little bit too far, this finding?
I do. I do. You know, and I don't know. I can't speak for the motives of those three councillors that left the room. That, you know, it might not have been. It might be coincidental that they were leaving at the time the vote was on.
Yeah.
You know, it may well not be coincidental. But you know, I would think that the community would generally expect councillors to participate in a vote that's before council. Potentially not in relation to this vote because it's quite a controversial issue, but I'd be concerned about councillors, you know, walking out when it got, you know, it got a bit, you know, a difficult issue and just not participating, and then it being problematic for another councillor to be critical of that sort of behaviour. I think the community expects councillors when they're elected to be present and say their piece.
Julie?
Yeah, and I agree with you, Tony, that the community would expect the councillors normally to be present. However, it is their responsibility to be accountable to the community. And so if they do choose to step out for whatever reason, then that's the hit that they take personally in that decision that they make. So I don't really have a problem with that as long as it's lawful. So I'm going back to the lawful side of things because I think, you know, they do have the right to step out when they want to and make that choice if they feel that something is, you know, too sensitive for them or too close or whatever it is, you know. So I think I agree with some of these words that are coming out are really poor choices of words. I mean, shamefully. I mean, that is just, it is going to be something that's going to upset someone if you use those kinds of words. So I agree that the use of those kind of words are not acceptable in the local government environment and on social media. And I think that whilst we've seen an extreme sort of case here and 1 month suspension as well, which I was a bit surprised about. I was probably more expecting something a little bit lesser than the 1 month. When I saw it, I thought, no, look, I agree with what the arbiters come up with, but I'm not too sure whether 1 month suspension equals what happened there, whether or not it should have been something lesser, you know, a public apology, you know, might have sufficed.
You agree with the finding, but you think the penalty or the sanction was going to be too harsh. All of it's a moot point, of course, because the councillor resigned, and from what I understand, the councillor wasn't intending to nominate for re-election in October, so effectively he's retired about a month out from when he was going to anyway. Interesting one, and of course, at the heart of this too is an issue that a lot of people don't believe councils should even be getting involved in. And one of those people is, just as an aside comment, the Nationals leader, Peter Walsh, who I think also, Tony, is the spokesperson or the opposition shadow, if you like, for local government. He's had a letter to the editor being published around the regional papers where he's called for candidates who will get back to basics, basically roads, rates and rubbish, my words, not his, and basically saying this social wokeness at councils has to stop. What struck me about that letter was, I mean, some people thought he's advocating councils to get more involved in operational areas. I'm not sure it quite goes there, but it's going around the regional papers, and I don't think it's the regional councils that have been doing the things that he's criticising councils for doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I've got some sympathy for his view. I personally don't like, and I've said on this program, I think councils should stick to resolutions on local government matters or local matters rather than, you know, nuclear energy, international conflicts, these sorts of things. And I think generally that's what the community want from their councillors. That's my view, and I know there's a very different view out there in the community. So to the extent that Peter Walsh is saying that, I think he's echoing a view amongst many in the community that perhaps some councils, and as you say, it hasn't typically been regional and rural councils, but some councils have sort of perhaps gone beyond that that ambit. And I honestly don't think the key players in some of these international disputes are taking much note of resolutions at a local level in Melbourne
I don't think
councils.
they are. I don't think they are. They are either, Tony. So the Peter Walsh letter wasn't even on my list. There's another one that sort of happened this week that's crept into our discussion points. We had an announcement this week from the government, from the local government minister, of another municipal monitor. Stephen Kingshott has been appointed at Horsham Rural City Council. By my count, I think it's 7 councils that have a current monitor arrangement in place. I'll double check that in a second. This one has been directly linked to the council's failure to adopt its budget by the legislated deadline. Tony, do you want to open the batting here?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think this is a welcome appointment, personally, even though I did, if you like, perhaps downplay the significance of the, just a 3-week miss on the deadline for adopting the budget last week in TGU. But I do think that anyone who's observed Horsham Council over the last term, there's clearly been some ongoing issues in terms of the way that the councillors are relating, the minority and majority group are relating to each other, some element of dysfunctionality, and potentially that is further heightened, I think, by the recent tragic passing of Councillor Bob Redden, which just makes the numbers more even at in the chamber in the lead up to the election as well. And I think the presence of a monitor until way beyond the elections, until 30 June 2025, will hopefully have a significant sort of moderating effect on debate and behaviours at Horsham Rural.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting,
Council.
Chris, because they're going to single member wards out at Horsham. So speaking to the Mayor and the CEO this week, they were saying that there could be a little bit of change as a result of, the move to single member wards, which we've seen typically happen where that move to single member wards has meant that there's been a bit of a spill out and new people coming in to represent those wards. So that will be interesting to see whether there will be quite a bit of change or quite a bit of spill out at this next election.
Yes, and not the only council, obviously, with the structural change that we'll need to keep an eye on. You mentioned running into Sunil, the CEO, and Robin, the Mayor there, Julie. That was at an event at Parliament House, I think, for the renewal of the Regional Cities Victoria Alliance, wasn't it? You were there?
That's right. Yeah. I went to part of it, Chris, and it was really great to see all the regional cities come together, all the CEOs with their mayors and some of the councillors to talk about the really important issues that are affecting regional Victoria and those regional cities, in particular housing. And I know that whilst I wasn't privy to it, I know that there was a presentation from Jerome Weinmar on the housing issue. And then the Minister for Planning, Sonia Kilkenny, of course, was there, and she spoke about the importance of planning and housing in particular. So housing featured really strongly, I believe, on that day, with them coming together with some serious concerns they have about servicing their community. And we've got a story today about Warrnambool, and Warrnambool were there, and Warrnambool are taking it into their own hands, Chris, aren't they, to deliver housing for their city. So it seemed as though it was a very successful event, very engaged councillors. The Premier was there, the Minister for Planning, the Minister for Local Government, Melissa Horne, the Minister for Regional Development, Gail Tierney, was there, and even Peter Walsh, the Shadow Minister for Regional Development and Local Government, was there as well. So it was jam-packed full of politicians in Parliament House that were running in and out between parliamentary debate, which But, again, great to see those regional cities getting together and advocating for what is important for their communities.
Good to have you there as our on-the-spot reporter, Julie. Thank you.
By default.
Now, you've mentioned that Warrnambool story. We may as well deal with that now. It got some coverage in The Age this week. Warrnambool City Council has identified 12 hectares of vacant land to deliver 50 homes. This is for key workers and those who are struggling to find affordable rental accommodation. It's been described as unusual and innovative, Tony.
Yeah. Look, I think we've seen some of this at times where councils sort of step in to try and help solve the shortage. It is acute in Warrnambool. I read in media reports that the current rental vacancy rate in Warrnambool is 0.8%. So, extreme shortage of housing. There's 35,000 people, but there's a shortfall of 1,600 homes. And the Mayor, Ben Blaine, has said, major employers are struggling to attract workers, partly because there's few places for workers to live. His statement is that it's slowing our growth as a city. This proposal, which would involve some rezoning of land, so the state government will need to be involved in terms of rezoning agricultural land to residential. It's a $15 to $18 million cost. But 50% of the housing is to be sort of quarantined with rent caps at 75% of the market rental rate. And these are sort of modular homes, so quick to construct and easy to sort of move around. So look, I think it's a great initiative by Warrnambool. It's a relatively small increase in homes in that area, 50 homes, and I mentioned that 1,600 home shortage. But kudos to the council. Well done to Ben Blaine, Mayor, and his colleagues and the CEO at Warrnambool.
Yeah, I think it's a great initiative as well. I've seen a little bit of this happening in small rural communities out in New South Wales, but not necessarily from an affordability point of view, but more to address the supply issue. So I think this addresses both some supply, only 50 houses, mind you, but it's still a significant, amount of extra homes and at a much more affordable price for those renters. Interesting with the council continuing to own the land, and I suspect that after a number of years they'll probably decide what they do with it depending on how successful it is. But yeah, no, they were really concerned about the weekly rental for people going up by over $100 or around about $100 since 2021, which was interesting. And they've got some major employers in Warrnambool, like the hospital and other big employers down there that need to attract workers and workers won't come if there's no housing. So I think it's a great solution, and good on them for taking the initiative.
Well done to Warrnambool, part of that Regional Cities Victoria group that we were talking about before. A few council notices of motion this week, councillor-led proposals that are perhaps worthy of note. We talked a few weeks ago about Mornington Peninsula Shire's move towards open briefing sessions, and we surmised or wondered at the time whether other councils would follow suit. Nobody going quite that far yet, Tony, but a resolution at Hobson's Bay this week that sort of deals with the material that comes out of, what have they described them, all meetings of an advisory committee of the council, and bringing some more transparency to that.
Yeah, I think this is a more measured move to improve that public transparency in council decision making. I think the language of the motion perhaps evolved over the last few weeks, but a notice of motion brought by Councillor Daria Calendar that was passed unanimously at Hobson's Bay City Council this week, resolving to prepare a record of all meetings of advisory committees of council, if at least one councillor is present, of any planned or unscheduled meeting of at least half of the councillors and at least one member of council staff which considers matters that are intended or are likely to be the subject of a decision of council or the exercise of one of those statutory functions of council or delegations.
So pretty much any meeting that a councillor's at.
Yeah. So I think it's a good development. I think it, as I say, adding to that transparency, but it basically almost returns that council to a situation that applied under the 1989 Act, where there would be minutes taken of an assembly of councillors, and those minutes will be tabled at a forthcoming council meeting. Who was there, what was discussed, in a summary form. Certainly not going to the extent of a full transcript or even and certainly not to the level of the public online access to the meeting that is being passed at Mornington Peninsula Shire. But I think interesting development, unanimously passed again at Hobson's Bay, and I think we could see this replicated at quite a number of councils, I suspect.
Part of this new wave of transparency that we've been talking about. Anything to say on that, Julie?
No, Chris.
All right, let's move on. Jim McGee at Glen Ira, a regular viewer of the program, put 2 notices of motion forward to that council this week, both interesting for different reasons. One, and they've received the support of the council. One is to look at a potential levy to mitigate the impacts of what Jim calls moonscaping. This is where developers put in very sparse sort of landscaping, loss of vegetation, loss of tree canopy as a result. The suggestion is that with the state government's help, a levy could apply to offset that in other parts of the municipality. A good idea, Tony, Julie?
Yeah, I like the idea, Chris. I think vegetation has been one of those issues that has been such a headache for so many councils across Victoria, particularly where development is concerned. The issue has been not only this moonscaping and not really putting back a significant amount of landscaping, but the issue of lopping of trees without approval as well, moonscaping without approval, with penalties that are not really that serious penalties, that the sector has been calling for a review of for some time. So I think that where there has been approval in this circumstance for there to be a loss of tree canopy, the council then can recoup back and can plant elsewhere to offset, which I think is a great idea. Now, I know that state government have offset regulations or legislation. Tony might know a little bit more about that than what I do, but this is maybe along similar lines, but more at a local level. Anyway, that's my views. I think it's worthwhile having that debate and discussion.
Yeah, and councils can be proven to be able to be effective in advocating for local changes with these sorts of things. I see that the City of Yarra has recently been successful in getting the public open space contribution for developments up to 8.65%, I think, which is
nearly doubling. I think it was 4.5%. Yeah.
So
and that's been a bit of a trend. There's been an increase across the board because I think councils have realised that those open space levies have been a bit too low to cover the real cost of provision of open space. Yeah.
So there's proof that councils can achieve things with advocacy here. So I think that the notice of motion by Councillor McGee is a starting point to an advocacy, a conversation with state government as well.
The other one that Councillor McGee brought forward, which I actually thought was more interesting, was one about calling on a bit more to be done ahead of the election to remind people about the use of public resources with regard to the council election campaign. This one particularly mentions state and federal resources such as electorate officers and their staff being used or misused to support local government election candidates. It felt like a bit of a shot across the bow here, Tony.
Oh, look, and can I say, as someone who's been a councillor and watched this for years, it is rife. and all the major political parties, I think, have at times had people, using parliamentary resources to support particular candidates. That's my observation. And we're talking about, as you say, the electorate officers' time when they're getting paid by the state of Victoria, assisting a local councillor candidate's campaign. We're talking about the photocopier machine at the electorate office, the paper allowance, these sorts of things. And in terms of a level playing field, if you're a candidate who's not associated with one of these political parties who are funded, through the electoral system, then you're at a disadvantage. And I think that it is a good reminder for those persons and individuals, and it would be good to see greater scrutiny.
Yeah, I would agree, Chris. I like the way it was worded about, raising awareness and highlighting the risks and taking reasonable steps and actively investigating. I like the wording in that notice of motion that makes it really clear what they're looking for. So yeah, good to raise that awareness now.
Absolutely. So that one was passed by the council. The previous one about the vegetation levy, they'll be receiving a further report on the implications and how that might work. So much to talk about, but I'm conscious Rhys Thomas is in the VLGA studio to talk about the model code of conduct. So we might just take a pause from the panel and head off to our segment with Rhys. But when we come back, still want to talk about this high-fiving issue. I want to talk about what's happening in New South Wales. That's a massive story. And we've got a couple of terrific little items from overseas to end on as well. So stay with us here on TGU. This week's segment with Rhys Thomas in the VLGA studio is called Resetting Expectations. I wonder what this could be about. Hello, Rhys.
G'day, Chris. Good to be here.
Good to see you again. Of course, as you flagged last week, model code of conduct out for consultation and some other material as well. You've been scrutinising this with a very fine scrut, as we say, and you're going to take us through some of these elements. How's it looking to you?
Well, pretty good. And I'll do my best to sort of run you through it in the time we have, because there's a lot here. And so last week, obviously, the government released 3 documents, and I'll talk about each of them, but they're in the latest stage of consultation on these reforms to the bill, to the act that we've been talking about now for a while. And I probably should say at the outset that the government's to be commended for giving the sector 4 weeks to respond, because past practice has shown that the sector doesn't always get quite that much time to provide feedback. So that's good. I'd still like it to be more, because 4 weeks doesn't allow most councils to actually take a position formally to a council meeting. But given the timeframes we have and the coming up election, I suppose it's probably the best we could manage. But
yeah, it's very late in the term, obviously, for this current council. But of course, the new council is going to need some time to get their head around these new policies as well, aren't they?
Yeah. So a bit of a challenge. So, obviously the main change that many people have been talking about is this model councillor code of conduct. So the existing standards of conduct in the Act will disappear from the regulations and be replaced with a model code. So we now know what that looks like, or at least in draft form. So I've had a bit of a look through it, and there's 13 standards that have either had a very minor change or just a few tweaks. They're the existing standards that have carried over. There's 4 standards of the existing ones that have been changed quite a bit, and there's 13 new standards. So it's not really a replacement of the existing standard. It's more an addition to them. In fact, there's only one standard that's been removed, and that's one related to mandatory training, which is picked up elsewhere in the changes. But some of the changes are significant. So I said that many of the changes have just had a small change, but that change is potentially quite meaningful in that it removes the caveat that the standard applies in performing the role of a councillor. So those words have been removed. So in some cases that really doesn't make any difference because of the nature of what councillors are being asked to comply with, but in some cases it could do. So by example, one of the standards currently requires that a councillor must ensure their behaviour does not bring credit upon the council in performing the role of a councillor. Now, removing those last words means that a councillor must ensure their behaviour does not bring discredit upon the council at all times, not just when they're acting as a councillor. So, we've talked quite a bit about how it's not possible for a councillor to just decide that they're not a councillor and take their councillor hat on and off. And it sort of seems that these changes are designed to reflect that.
That's really interesting, and I think a lot would welcome that. I think you first said credit when you meant discredit. Of course, anything that would bring something that would be damaging to the reputation of the council in their activities, whether they're saying they've got their councillor hat on or not.
Yeah, and that probably means that there'll be less arguments. There certainly have been arbiter cases and code of conduct cases where there's been a lot of time spent on was a councillor acting as a councillor or not, and different decisions have landed in different places. So maybe this puts that all to bed and says that regardless of what you're doing, everyone knows you're a councillor, so you should behave like one.
And some tweaking to what it means to engage in robust political debate or public debate and what that actually means.
Yeah, and it's a removal of just a couple of words, and or the insertion, I should say. And so we're talking about the exemption that applies to all the standards of conduct that says that nothing in those standards is intended to limit robust public debate of issues. Now, the words of the issues have now been removed. So essentially, inserted. The words of the issues have now been inserted. So what I think that is saying is robust public debate, if it's about talking about the issues before council or the matter at hand, then that's fine. But the exemption just doesn't give you a license to attack the individuals involved, criticise individual councillors or members of the public just at will because you think that that's robust public debate. So that's probably a good improvement, I would think.
Also, Rhys, I noticed in your analysis some powers for the CEO in relation to the health and safety obligations toward councillors. I'm really keen to understand what those sort of powers look like. How will that play out?
Yeah, so it's a good improvement, I think, and that is that under the current Act, the CEO has a responsibility for the health and safety of councillors, just like an employer has responsibility for the health and safety of all their staff. So councillors are not staff, which means that they're not ordinarily required to follow workplace health and safety policies. They don't have to do the sort of training and e-learning modules that staff in organisations would be familiar with. Councillors aren't required to do any of that. So these changes are designed to make that shift. So councillors are now required to undertake training if directed by the CEO, and they're required to comply with reasonable health and safety policies, and they're required to accept responsibility for their own workplace health and safety. So really what it's doing is it's extending the sorts of obligations that staff currently have to councillors.
So in general, though, you think this is all still pretty high level and open to interpretation? Is that just to keep it in the context of a principles-based body of legislation, do you think?
That's my thinking. It would be great to see a whole lot of detail about, councillors can do this and can't do that and must do this and mustn't do that. But the truth is, if you try and document it that way, you end up creating a whole series of loopholes and arguments about exactly what behaviour fits in what category. So there is a need for a sort of a broad statement, but ultimately it comes down to the quality of the guidance material. So the draft documents talk about the release of guidance material to assist in interpreting these provisions, but we haven't seen any of that yet. So that all remains to be seen, really.
Okay, there's a lot more detail, obviously, in the guidance or the advice that you've sent out to members, and we can't replicate all of that here. What about these new policies that are going to be required?
So you might recall when the Act first came out, there was a discussion, I think it was on TGU actually, about this new head of power for new policies, governance policies that were to be imposed on organisations, but we didn't know what they would be. So we now know what they are. There's two of them. There's a councillor social media policy and a council confidentiality policy. So the confidentiality policy is a tricky one because it's kind of intended to govern the access and disclosure of documents which would not ordinarily be confidential information under the definition in the Act, but they might be internal working documents. It's most likely to apply to councillor briefing papers and whether or not councils are comfortable with having that released. So there will have to be a bit of work done about how that applies, what's the interrelationship between the definition of confidential information, how does freedom of information apply to all of this? And so there's a bit of kinks to be worked out there.
And that's interesting in the broader context of some councils looking at the role of briefing sessions, the openness, the transparency, et cetera, and they're actually considering a lot of those issues right now, aren't they?
It does, and this seems to go the other way. So we're going to have to sort that out as a sector. And one of the challenges, of course, with the Principles-Based Act is you won't get a consistent interpretation right across the sector.
Yeah.
So every council's going to end up landing somewhere slightly different.
And the social media policy you're talking about is specifically about councillors' use of social policy and separate to or adjacent to the organisation's social media policy that you would expect that to have in place?
I think it's separate too. I think obviously they'd be designed to be complementary, but this one's very much targeted at councillors. But reading between the lines a little bit, it seems to me like it's actually designed to be an enabling policy. It's important, for example, in fact, it's necessary that the councillor social media policy enshrine the right of councillors to express an independent view, independent of the council. So that's important. And depending on how councils land when they develop these policies, hopefully there'll be a whole lot more information supporting councillors in understanding what sort of disclaimers or statements they should put on their pages, when and where they should speak using their councillor title, when they shouldn't, that sort of thing. But it might also have provisions around councillors and trolling, setting up anonymous accounts, purporting to represent community groups, astroturfing, all the sorts of things that I don't think are common, but I think might be necessary to include in a policy of that kind.
Just before we move on from that, Rhys, this issue of the right for a councillor to express an independent view, is there any distinction about when that can occur? And I'm thinking, before a council decision is made and post a council decision being made?
Well, it doesn't say. I would think that it should be possible to do both. The thing is, there's actually three kinds of views here. There's a councillor speaking on behalf of the council. So that should be fairly unusual unless you're the mayor. Although, as I suppose, a councillor could certainly retweet or like a official council post. I'm sure that'll be allowed for. Then there's a councillor acting as an independent councillor, acting individually. So that is going to be enshrined. But then there's this idea of a councillor speaking personally and not as a councillor. And I don't think that'll be provided for. I think that combined with the changes to the Code of Conduct is going to mean that that's something that, unless they're in a completely private, family chat or something, everything that a councillor says online should be deemed as an official statement by that councillor.
Yeah. So tying in with the comments that you were making earlier, let's talk briefly about training, the mandatory training. We've got a picture of what that's going to look like now.
Yeah, and look, I think it's pretty good. There's obviously new training for the mayor and deputy mayor. We knew that was coming. It's good to see some training on that particular role, because I think councillors do step into that role sometimes without really knowing what it entails. I expect, in fact, that many councils, given the opportunity, may make that training available, or at least part of it available to all councillors, so that councillors understand the role, particularly if they're planning to put their hand up at some point in the future. I'd have liked to see a little bit more in there about the mayor's role in managing disputes between councillors. That doesn't appear to be captured in the induction training, but there is a provision that requires the organisation to support the mayor in that role, which goes sort of some way to achieving that. I think it probably means that when it happens, then the organisation would assist the mayor through all of the necessary steps. So that's the mayor training. Then you've got the councillor group, and probably the most pleasing inclusion, and I think many people have talked about it, is the requirement that there be some teamwork involved, including the development of a group vision for councillors. So I think that'll be a really positive step, bringing the councillors together as a group right at the beginning of their term. Now, there are some challenges, like what will you do if one councillor doesn't attend? You obviously have to go ahead with the training. How does that councillor then catch up on the training and satisfy their obligation? And similarly, if a councillor was to join partway through a term due to a casual vacancy, how would you induct them into a pre-existing team. But I'm sure there's a way to sort of work out those kinks.
And what about, Rhys, in the case, because I'm sure it'll happen, I've heard of it happening in the past, the councillor that just refuses to participate in that teamwork element because of whatever reason, how is that proposed to be dealt with?
Well, interestingly, the requirement to participate in the training no longer exists as a standard of conduct, but there's perhaps a keener penalty for a councillor that doesn't participate, which is that once the 4 months runs out, if they haven't participated in the training, then they stop receiving their allowance. And so that requires them to pay attention and quick smart get involved. So one of the challenges for councils, of course, is going to be they'll have undertaken an induction program and often engaged facilitators or other people like the VLGA to come into their organisation and deliver it. And if a councillor simply doesn't attend and needs a catch-up session, then there's an expense for the council in how to deal with that. How do you actually do the catch-up session? Do you get your facilitator back in at great expense for that one councillor? So that's actually one of the things as part of the VLGA's councillor readiness program, which we'll be launching very shortly. We'll be including sort of catch-up sessions so that towards the end of that 4 months, councillors from various places across the Victoria who may have missed a session for whatever reason can come together with the VLGA and do a catch-up and bring themselves up to compliance.
And that's important because we in this last term, we've had more than 60 changeovers of councillors. Some of them have come very late in the piece, so there's no countback or by-election required. But all of those people coming into the council environment would need to be factored into that.
They will.
Training.
And that also relates to the ongoing professional development, because that's the other part of this proposal, which is a requirement every 12 months to undertake further training. And while the draft documents map out what that training would be, and they're largely extensions of what's in the induction program, plus a bunch of other specific things, there's no information yet on exactly how that is to be delivered. So are each of those elements to be delivered each year, or are they to be delivered just once during the 4 years? How do we manage the final year of the term, which is obviously not a whole calendar year? It finishes at the election time. There's a whole lot of detail that the new Act says, or the new bill says, that will be included in regulations. And because we don't have the actual regulations yet, we don't know what that's going to look like.
And just quickly, the internal resolution procedure, that's also part of this consultation?
It is, and I'd sort of hoped to see a model procedure. I think many had, and there isn't one. It basically is a very brief document that says that it's up to council to develop its own internal resolution procedure, provided it satisfies a few specific high-level requirements. So I think what's likely to happen in reality is most councils will look at their existing councillor code of conduct and extract from that the internal resolution procedure that currently exists for those councils that have one, of course. So there'll be a bit of a sort of a translation from one document to the other. And that'll be a shame if people do that without taking the opportunity to look at the procedure and see whether any improvements can be made.
So, Rhys, the consultation for this closes 4th of September. I think that's a couple of weeks shy of the caretaker period starting. So do you expect that many councils will be able to fully consider this and reach a formal position on these proposals?
Look, I think probably not. The timing is such that most councils that are having a meeting before the deadline, before the 4th of September, are probably packaging up their agenda for that meeting right now if they haven't done it already. So it's probably too late to get a formal position from councils. Of course, councils don't need one. There's no requirement that councils endorse a submission, but many councils may expect to have significant influence. But of course, councillors can submit to the process in their own right, and that's allowed for. And there's a particular box you tick when you submit it on the engage.vic.gov.au website. So councillors who have strong views here perhaps should put some energy into writing their own submission.
So you've provided a lot of detail to members. You're no doubt getting some feedback. Is the VLGA's intention to put a response into this material?
Yeah, so we'll be doing a submission on behalf of our membership. In fact, I'm meeting, well, it'll be earlier today by the time you're watching this, but it's later today at the time we're recording it. I'm meeting with governance officers from VLGA councils right across Victoria to inform that submission. I'm doing that today, and hopefully the governance officers will go away with a bit of a better understanding of the provisions and to inform their own submissions, and we can make a meaningful contribution here to the process.
Well, good luck with those conversations. The governance geek in me thinks that will be very interesting and an exciting process to be part of. So all the best, Rhys.
Thank you.
Rhys Thomas is from the VLGA and joins us every week here on TGU with some interesting observations, and that's a very important one. So thanks for the work you've been doing on that, Rhys, and we'll talk to you again soon. Terrific to have that level of analysis from Rhys on the model code of conduct and those other pieces of information. Tony, you're the lawyer in the group. How did he do?
Rhys is awesome. There's a lot of research that goes into these pieces, everyone, each week, and Rhys just consistently does it. And I think a lot of thinking, well thought out, and you can see the years and years of experience that he's drawing on, and the team at VLGA.
You missed an opportunity though, Tony, to say that he did reasonably well.
Oh, he did reasonably well. We're going to run out of Rhys puns soon, aren't we? But look,
but you've got to put. There's a point of difference though from your thinking on this robust political debate issue.
Yeah. Look. I think that there's some discussion around changing that language to more, something like healthy political debate, and I just wonder whether focusing always on the recipient or the person you're talking about will be the right thing in this context. I think the government's largely got this right. I agree. I think that great improvement having the policy around confidential information, the social media policy, the additional training. I think when it comes to standards of conduct, I think we missed an opportunity. The language continues to be very general and vague, and whilst no one would argue against the thrust of a standard that says avoid any action which may diminish the public's trust and confidence in the integrity of local government, as a lawyer I can tell you that I don't know what that means, and someone will have to actually interpret that. So it has a common sense meaning, but in a legal sense, we're going to need lots of arbiter and council conduct panel decisions to tell us what that really means. And I think there was an opportunity to go for more specificity in the standards, like LG Pro were pushing for in their submission at one point. Things like if a councillor misleads, it makes a statement which turns out to be inaccurate or misleading, they have to correct the record. We've stuck with the vague general language, which requires interpretation.
All right, thank you, Tony. Enough on that topic, I think, for this week. We've still got a few things we want to get through. I know there's an FOI question around, and perhaps some advice from you, Tony, around the conversations that councillors have using council-provided platforms, such as, a chat function in Microsoft Teams.
Yeah, so this arises from, there's been an FOI application. It's got some wide publicity on social media over the last week or so. It was an application made to the City of Stonington by Dean Hurlston's a well-known person in council circles. I think he's president of a group called Council Watch. He made an application for the Microsoft Teams chat records of 3 named councillors for a 3-month period at City of Stonington. I understand that the applicant believed that those councillors were in the habit of exchanging MS Teams messages during council meetings. So one might reasonably assume, messages relating to their views potentially on, the topic at hand, the speakers, be they, councillors, council officers, members of the public. Council's response is that they have located a number of documents in relation to the request, but they're declining to provide them, citing, there's a likelihood that the applicant will publish them, that they're internal working documents because council laws are deliberating on, decisions, and it's against the public interest because it'd inhibit, candour and frankness in communications. Look, I'm not so persuaded by that reasoning. Be interested to see if there's an appeal and what happens. But I think it's really important. The important point here, councillors, when they're using, particularly when they're using council-provided, emails, chat platforms, etc., need to be aware that their communications are likely subject to FOI application and, could well then potentially become public. So it's a whole new, I haven't heard of this before, this sort of, this use
I
of
was
this.
waiting for it.
No, there you go, Julie. Yeah. So you've seen it.
I've been training staff and talking to staff about, the importance of, the use of those kind of tools and ensuring that they're aware that all of this potentially is public information. And
Well, it's about what constitutes a record, doesn't it?
That's
So
right.
this creates a record.
Yeah.
Julie or Tony, you might be able to answer this. In my past, I had some involvement in this FOI space. It used to be a consideration of releasing material that when you release it under FOI, you're releasing it to the public at large. Is that still the thinking? Because I wonder how you could then argue that the likelihood of it being published when released is actually a reason for denying access.
Yeah, look, and I'm not an FOI expert, I'll say that right now, but I think, the question of who we're giving this information to seems to have been much of part of the reasoning of Stonington in refusing here, and that's clear from the letter that's been published, the response letter from council that's been widely published on social media, and I don't doubt that reasoning might be what subject to challenge. The applicants on the record is saying they're going to the Victorian Information Commissioner for that review process.
Yeah.
That will be an interesting one to follow.
I think so. Yeah. Let's see what happens with that review and see which way the commissioner goes with it.
All right, still a bit to get through. Let's quickly talk about this one out in Yarra Ranges. Tony, Julie, what's your view on whether a school crossing supervisor should be able to high-five students, either on the crossing or, in this case, where the complaint was made, students holding their hand out the open window of a moving car?
So remembering that this has come from a complaint, okay, and that's the important thing here is the council has reacted in a way that has tried to ensure that they address the complaint because someone's raised a concern.
A parent that,
there's concern around safety for their children. And there are very strong child safe standards out there now that we all have to adhere to. And so I'm not surprised by this. Whether it feels right, it just feels a bit sad, doesn't it, that we can't high-five our school crossing supervisor. But, this is the space I think that we're in now with the legal space and with child safe standards that, anything that could possibly go wrong in this space is not good for the council or that school's crossing supervisor. Anyway, that's my view.
Of course,
it's sad, but that's
that's
the situation.
I think that's a good take on it, Julie. The media reports, of course, have beat this up and created concern, which the council's had to respond to. But I think the legalities here are pretty clear, aren't they, Tony?
Well, we're talking about, a complaint about high-fiving the children in a moving car or in the car and the car pulling up, and so I can understand the safety concerns. So whilst this might, in a superficial read might seem a bit overly officious of the council, I think when you drill into the detail of what's occurring, if the council didn't act, as Julie says, on a complaint from the parents, the council would be subject to a hell of a lot of criticism if there was any injury or suffering that occasioned from this. And you can see we can all see the potential for that.
Oh, absolutely.
Risk,
Yeah. All right, you can follow that one. Yarra Ranges has put a couple of statements up on their website, including some comments from the mayor, which rightly point to the value that school crossing supervisors provide, but also, you know, balancing the council's responsibility to ensure safety. So let's head into New South Wales for a few comments on this massive story up there. They are a month ahead of Victoria in going to election. Nominations closed on Wednesday. Lo and behold, about 136, I believe the number is, expected candidates as part of endorsed Liberal Party nominations were not there. Because there's been a stuff up, basically. This means that more than 40 sitting councillors who thought they would be going around again are going to be automatically retired when the term ends, and they'll be looking for something else to do. It just must be devastating for those people in particular.
It's a timely reminder,
You're both shaking
you know.
your heads, and I think you're a bit speechless.
Just a timely reminder. I think that any council or candidate would want to, you know, do the nomination yourself in Victoria, or at least rely on someone that you have absolute faith and trust in to get it done. I mean, this notion of leaving it, and I know it's a political party element here, but leaving it to someone else, you know, is just subject to, you know, these sort of stuff ups. And you know, well, may some of those council candidates may well be thinking, gosh, I wish I had put in my nomination myself and not left it to my party to do it for me.
Because the process isn't hard, really, is it? It's a pretty simple process to nominate. Surely.
Yeah, but it also shows that if you don't get in by deadline, there's no do-overs. There's no nomination process that you can rely on. An election analysis by the name of Ben Rao, who has this excellent website called the Tally Room, has crunched the numbers here and come up with, I think it's 18 councils that either have no Liberal nominated candidates or not as many as they were meant to be. The 136 number, I think, came from Ben, and I think it's 48 current councillors, including at least one deputy mayor and one in Northern Beaches who was expecting to run for mayor. It's pretty devastating stuff. And as Ben says, it's changed the face of those council areas in terms of the likely result, because voters have a few conservative options to vote for, I think were his words. The other element of this is the state director of the Liberal Party was called on to resign, refused to do so. It sort of pointed the finger at the state president, who'd apparently volunteered to look after the process. State executive called a meeting last night, and in breaking news this morning, I believe the state director has been sacked from his position. People have been baying for blood and calling for heads, and it looks like they've got some of that, at least at this point of time, as we record this episode. Just extraordinary stuff.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I've been sitting here as I've been doing the roundup thinking, you know, what's another word for blunder, debacle, stuff up? We've used them all. There's got to be a few more.
But I won't say the rest of it.
Yeah. All right. So there's enough in the media about that without us doing too much. Let's head overseas for a couple of stories before we wrap up. A couple that caught my eye. Let's go to Germany first. There's a city there called Heilbronn where some of the councillors want to ban kebab shops from the centre of the city. They say they have a negative magnet effect, which is an interesting concept I hadn't heard before. But apparently other councillors are worried about the effect of a ban on kebabs on the currywurst and the pizza stands, which obviously don't have a negative magnet effect. What do we make of this, team?
Oh, look, this is an interesting one, Chris. It's they're also saying that there's also an increased concentration of barber shops and nail salons and betting establishments as well. So this is not just about kebabs. Can I just say that? It's about these other types of uses that they're wanting to control, because they're getting a dominance of those kind of uses, and they want a mixture of uses to serve the local community. Okay. Now, this is classic what you find in these city areas where you'll get these dominance or clusters, I suppose, of these types of uses. But in planning terms, you can't really control who moves in. Like you can control, say, whether it's retail or whether it's commercial space or whether it's industrial or whatever. And you might be able to control certain things, but you certainly can't control the type of shop type of retail that might move in there. You might have a category of food and drink premises or restaurants or cafes, but you can't say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to, have only particular types of cafes because I'm a coffee snob and I only want, good cafes with good coffee, so you can't do that in planning terms. And this is what some of these cities have been finding. It was the same when I worked at Westminster in London. The late night economy was taking over in Soho, Covent Garden. Late night uses, drinking establishments, those kind of establishments that were causing issues for the community there in terms of impact of antisocial behaviour. But again, it was very, very hard to bring in policies to be able to stop licensed premises from moving into, what was the entertainment capital of, of London. So similar here. They're saying it's having a negative effect, but they're going to struggle, I think, to try and diverse the offerings. I'm not too sure what kind of controls they have to be able to do that. I'm not convinced.
And not sure if they have the numbers either, but Tony, I wouldn't have thought kebab shops were that offensive in and of themselves.
Well, I think maybe in my younger days, I might have left an establishment late at night and craved a kebab, and they're trying to keep those people away. I think, look, it's quite a socialist kind of step, isn't it? Like the market forces really decide these things, one would think, and yeah, I think it's a strange move from Heil Bron.
I think they will probably fail.
You can read that one on an excellent site called themayor.eu, which gives me a few good stories every now and then for the local government news roundup. And one to finish on, Thanet Council in the UK wants to fine people for swearing in the streets. This, as you can imagine, is getting a bit of attention from the tabloids. Tony?
Yeah, look,
Shaking your head.
Well-meaning, but I don't like the idea of making council officers sort of quasi police officers. I'd say let the police sort this sort of behavior out. Don't condone offensive type language in public by any means, but I think it's putting the council officers in an interesting situation too, where you're issuing presumably an on the spot fine to someone. How do you prove it? Do you got to get it on, get it recorded? Is it your word against theirs, witnesses, this sort of thing?
There's going to be a lot of grumpy parents with kids being sent home, teenage kids being sent home with £100 fines. That's all I can say.
Yes.
They're not going to be very happy with the council.
I always swore in my father's native tongue and got away with it at school. Do that.
It's only £60 if you pay it within 14 days, Julie.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, it's still a lot of money,
It is. All right, that's.
Not a good idea.
I think that's all we need to say about that one. We're not certainly not advocating that any Australian councils follow suit on that front. As you can expect, opinion about that in Thanet is quite divided. All right, that's been a very busy edition of TGU with lots to talk about. Hopefully something else happens between now and next week, and we have more to talk about when we come back with another edition of TGU. Tony, thank you to you and the team at Hunt & Hunt Lawyers for sponsoring the program and for allowing us to have you for an hour each week to talk about the news.
Great pleasure, guys.
And Julie Reid, thank you. Always great to have you with us, and I hope you have a great week ahead as well.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you to the viewer and the listener. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already, or follow us in your podcast player. And we'll be back with more from VLGA Connect very soon. Bye for now.